Hello folks, and welcome back to my channel. Today's video was actually requested by a number of folks over on TikTok. And so we're talking about how to stay safe as an apprentice or an apprentice hopeful looking to get into the piercing industry. Now, it is no secret that the piercing industry has a major problem with abuse in apprenticeships. I've talked about it multiple times here on my page. Many other piercers have talked about it as well. The Association of Professional Piercers even has a whole section about abuse on their site. Now, if you're someone who's thinking about getting into the industry, it can be pretty overwhelming to read all of these accounts of harm and abuse and violence that can occur in apprenticeships and wonder, I still really want to do this. I'm still really called to piercing. I love hearing about piercings. I'm passionate about it. But how do I get into the industry and not have these experiences happen to me that happen to so many others? How do I stay safe? So today I'd like to talk about my best tips and suggestions for people who want to get into the industry to do so in a way that ensures that they are still safe and protected. And the first and biggest tip is going to be do your research. I know that's like kind of a boring one, but I'm serious, do your research. I have multiple videos here on YouTube and multiple blog posts that talk about issues with abuse in apprenticeships and also talk about what's normal and what you can expect for an apprenticeship and what isn't. The Association of Professional Piercers also has an apprenticeship guideline that's publicly available online that goes over what a good apprenticeship should look like, what should happen, and also what shouldn't happen. I've even got videos about legally what your rights are as an apprentice in America. That way you can help with things like making sure you're legally being paid and all of that. But the best thing that you can do before starting an apprenticeship is do lots of research. That way you come into the process knowing your worth and knowing what you deserve. How so many people get taken advantage of is they simply don't know what's normal or don't know what's right from wrong. Someone goes into a studio and they're like, oh, hey, you seem like you're cool. Do you want to come be an apprentice? And you just think, yeah, wow, I'd love to be a body piercer. But before you know it, they're telling you that you have to work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, unpaid. You have to get the shop logo tattooed on you. And they're going to make you do all sorts of wild stuff that doesn't relate to apprenticing at all. But if you do your research and you understand how apprenticeships work, you understand labor law requirements in America for apprenticeships, you understand what to expect and what not to expect, you could get an offer like that and know, oh, this isn't somewhere I want to apprentice. I know that these things are wrong. These things they're asking me to do or telling me I'll have to do, this isn't right. So the biggest first thing you can do is research. And I'm going to include some links to those blog posts here in the comments below, and also a link to my playlist about apprenticeships here on YouTube that's full of a lot of great information, as well as that safe piercing guideline. But sometimes, even with all the research in the world, some studios and some mentors can be pretty awesome manipulators and pretty insidious at getting people to sign on and agree to an apprenticeship. And then as time goes on, they reveal their true nature. And that can be a really hard situation to find yourself in. You did all your research, you thought you did everything right, you're still stuck in an apprenticeship where you're not being taught correctly, where you're not being treated right, and now you don't know how to leave. And that leads us into some of my other tips that I would suggest anyone getting an apprenticeship do, no matter how much you think you trust the studio, no matter how much you think you trust your mentor, just to be safe and cover your butt. And the second biggest tip is document everything. What I mean by this is if you get accepted for an apprenticeship, you're ready to start, you're excited, I want you to go home and make a folder on your computer, make a spreadsheet on your iPad, get a notebook and write it down physically, but I want you to document everything. I want you to document the hours that you worked, what you went over each day, what you were paid each pay period, and tasks that you were required to do. Now, this doesn't have to be super in-depth. It can be as simple as just writing down Monday, worked 8 hours, talked about nostril piercings. Tuesday, worked 8 hours, cleaned the shop. Wednesday, worked 4 hours, watched some doth piercings. You know, it doesn't have to be super in-depth, but you want to keep a record of everything. This is really good for two reasons. One, if you end up with a great apprenticeship, you've got this really nice log of all of your work and learning hours, and some of the notes that you take about what you learn each day can be incredibly helpful to reflect on and review on. Just in general, if I were to have an apprentice, they would be required to keep a daily log, both for their own protection and safety, but because I think it's a really good idea to write down notes of what you're learning or what you did. You have that to look back on, you have it to refer back to, and I promise you 10 years down the line in your career, you'll be happy you had something like this. However, somewhat more importantly, if you have a log like this, it gives you a really powerful legal leg to stand on if your mentor does end up being shady or violating the rules. I mention all the time that apprentices are required by law to be paid, and that these lawsuits have held up in court on the side of the apprentice. For one of my friends who was an apprentice in Oregon, she was required to keep logbooks of all of her work hours as part of obtaining her license in Oregon. Because she kept logbooks of everything worked, when she found out that she was owed back wages for over a year of work, when she went to court, she had a log and a record of every hour she had ever worked at the studio. And because she had all of these records, she was able to get the money that she had been owed for all of that time working unpaid. So God forbid a situation were to happen like that with your mentor, where they weren't paying you, or they weren't paying you fairly, or they tried to say that you hadn't learned anything or things like that. You now have an actual concrete record that can hold up in court to say, no, I was here, I worked these days, here's all the hours I worked, here's all the time I put in, and here's a rough idea of what I was doing. It's incredibly helpful to have something like this, and I think it's a great educational tool. So I would suggest any piercer go ahead and do that. The third step is be careful of contracts. Now, a lot of studios like to make folks sign what's called a non-compete. It's basically a contract that says if you agree to work here, whenever you leave, whether you quit, whether you're fired, you can't work anywhere within a certain radius of the studio for however many years. And I really hate these contracts. I think they're very unethical. I think any truly good studio is not going to require you to sign something like this. And I don't think they tend to hold up well in court. That being said, sometimes a studio just insists on doing it, or it is what it is, but you want to really read over those contracts and be careful. Don't just sign the first thing that you're given and just agree to it to get the apprenticeship. Actually read over the contract, read everything it says. If you're able to afford to have a lawyer look over it and give you some information about it, that's helpful too. If you can't, I would just ask some close people who you trust, who have some business acumen, to read over it and just see what it's looking like. A lot of times non-competes don't hold up in court, but if you don't have the money for a court case or a court battle, you may be SOL if that's the case. And a lot of these non-competes that the industry will try and make people sign wouldn't even make it to court anyway, because they're not properly drawn up contracts. Either way, I see a lot of folks find themselves in a difficult position where they are forced to sign something like this when they first start working at a studio, and then as they're there, they realize they're in an abusive situation, but because of this contract and the threat of a lawsuit, they feel like they're trapped there for however long the contract states, or their owner or manager is holding the contract over their head. So if you are getting an apprenticeship and you're told there's a contract you need to sign initially, and a lot of good studios and good apprenticeships have apprenticeship contracts, so I'm not saying that all contracts are bad, but definitely really read them over. Definitely be wary of a non-compete contract. Definitely be wary of an NDA or a non-disclosure agreement, and just have other people look over the contracts and see how you're feeling. If you're looking at a contract and you have really bad vibes about what you're asking to sign, you're probably right. Maybe don't sign it. And if anyone has any questions about their contract, or they're not sure if it's legal or if they should sign something, my inbox is always open. I'm always happy to help with that sort of thing. But definitely be careful with any contracts that you're asked to sign. And then my last really big piece of advice is to build yourself while you build your studio. So now, what do I mean by that? So oftentimes in apprenticeships, apprentices are doing work that is not just about learning piercing for their mentor, and a big part of this is social media. And that's because social media is an incredibly important part of our industry, regardless of who you are. Whether you're a jewelry stylist, a piercer, a tattoo artist, a studio manager, social media plays a role in your success and what you're doing in the industry. It just is how it is today. Social media is how clients find and connect with us. It's how they get information about pricing and healing. It's how we advertise ourselves to our communities. And one of the more insidious ways that abusive mentors and bad studios try and control apprentices is by controlling their social media. Oftentimes, this looks like being told you're not allowed to post anything on social media at all during your apprenticeship, or anything you post has to be credited to the studio. Both of those things are really big red flags. An apprentice, no matter where they are in their apprenticeship, should be allowed to have their own social media page where they brand themselves. Now, if a studio wants to have social media rules, such as no offensive content on the page, no political content on the page, only pictures with this type of lighting or this type of editing, those are reasonable. Some studios are very strict about what they want their employees posting on social media, and some studios like to have all of their employees have a consistent branding across their images. That's totally normal. But if your studio is saying you aren't allowed to post anything at all or ever advertise yourself online, I would say that that's a pretty big red flag. And a reason why a lot of studios do this is so that if they decide to fire you or cut ties with you halfway through your apprenticeship or halfway through your employment, it's really hard for you to go somewhere else if you don't have any portfolio of anything for people to look at. And they can make that really easy by preventing you from having social media. And this is something that I see happen a lot. And then studios will threaten their apprentices and their employees with it. Well, you don't have an Instagram. You don't have social media. Who would hire you? Who would take you? You have to stay here and put up with the stuff I'm putting you through. In general, when you're sitting down to discuss an apprenticeship, I would mention being allowed to have social media, what that would look like, what content you could and couldn't post, and I would start building a social media presence right away in your apprenticeship from day one. This gives you the foundation of a great portfolio that helps clients find you down the line, and God forbid your situation ends up becoming unsafe, it allows you to have that as a portfolio to show to other studios to find more employment. If you're in a situation where they're just absolutely not going to let you do anything, it's still your piercings that you're doing, that's still your work. You are still following their contract if you take those pictures and simply don't post them. And then if you need them in the future, you have them. Now, despite all of this advice and how much research and how much care you put into this, sometimes you still may find yourself in an unsafe situation where you're in an apprenticeship where you're potentially dealing with abuse or violence, where you're potentially dealing with emotional abuse and mental abuse, or you're potentially not being fairly paid. If that is a situation for you, my advice is always going to be to leave. I know it can seem overwhelming and daunting. This feels like the only apprenticeship you'll ever get, the only chance you'll ever get, but it's not. And I know a lot of times your mentor or your boss or your studio owner will threaten you and make you feel like if you leave, you'll never make it back in the industry. And that's also simply not true. There is so much opportunity and so much potential in this industry, especially for someone who has the wherewithal to look at a situation that's bad or unsafe like that and the courage to leave when they understand that what they're experiencing, the training they're getting is not right. You never deserve to stay in a studio situation where you feel unsafe, where you feel threatened, or where you are not being treated fairly. And if that ever gets to the point for you, I would strongly encourage you to leave. If you feel as though leaving the studio may put you in a position of danger, I suggest quietly removing your personal belongings from the studio before you give your notice, and having a friend or trusted family member with you to give your notice if you think the situation could escalate to violence. You are also under no obligation to give notice in person if you believe your safety could be at risk. If you believe that someone you work with could become violent or a situation could become unsafe, quietly and low-key remove your personal objects from the studio, leave the studio, and give your final notice either through a phone call, through an email, or through a message. Keep it polite but brief, and then stop contact if they begin to threaten you or get violent. But please, whatever you do, be cautious in leaving situations like this. If you're worried it can escalate to violence, please take extra precautions, and above all, please be safe. If you are currently into this industry or thinking about getting into the industry, I hope you find this video helpful in how to kind of prepare for an apprenticeship and what to do to make sure that you stay safe. Unfortunately, we can only do so much to prepare, and we can't avoid every negative or unsafe situation, but doing things like this, planning ahead and doing your research, documenting everything from the start, and making sure you're building up yourself and your presence along with the studio are all some things that you can do to really make sure that you stay safe in your apprenticeship, and if you find yourself in a situation where you have to leave, you're able to do so. I'm going to add links to lots of different resources in the comments section of this video, and if there's anything else you'd like to see me talk about when it comes to apprenticeships, abuse, and safety, please let me know. I would love to help out with this more. As per usual, if you like this video and the content I put out, please hit like and subscribe. Your support means the world to me, and it's how we keep this channel going. I hope you have an awesome day. I really hope this video helped, and I'm sure we will sit down and chat again soon. Bye.